Thank all of you for being here today and for those who helped make this visit possible. I am really excited about sharing my new book with you, and I really think, to start with, what I'd like to do is to tell you why I wrote the book. It is not just simply an ego trip. So I would like you to get some feeling for why the book is here at all. Almost 6 years ago, I undertook a daunting project. I decided to write my autobiography, one that included my 4 years as Oregon's governor. At that time, Madeline Kunin, Governor Madeline Kunin of Vermont, was the only female governor in our country to have put her story into a book. Her book, Living a Political Life, was published in 1994. A decade later, no other woman governor had told her story. Ann Richards of Texas had completed her autobiography late in her term as state treasurer, but it did not give the reader her experiences as a candidate for governor or as a woman governor. Now, as one of America's first 10 women governors, I was becoming alarmed that our place in history would go unrecorded, told perhaps by others, but not by the women who politically pioneered those positions. Time was passing. 4 of the first 10 women governors who were elected in their own right were already deceased. I began to feel a need, an obligation to tell my story, to share a piece of the puzzle that would help paint the picture of America's early women governors. And so I began writing. My family, my childhood, my early marriage, the birth of my 2 sons, the end of a 16-year marriage, my struggles as a single parent. Month after month I wrote. I recalled, I relived those early years of my life, both joy and pain. Chapter after chapter I wrote. I researched newspapers, the Oregon Archives records, school records, legislative papers, family documents. My memories became a manuscript. And now my manuscript is a book, Up the Capitol Steps. So what I'd like to do for a little while today is to give you 3 segments from the book, all very different periods of my life and very different stories, to give you some sense not only of the book, but of my life. Many times I think people look at a governor and they think you're sort of born full-blown as a governor. You just get born and then you're governor and there's nothing in between. Well, it doesn't work that way, believe me. And so I wanted people to understand that a governor can come from any place, literally any place. And I wanted people to know something about the kind of child I was, the kind of young adult I was, and then how I made that step that put me in the governor's race. A little piece of that campaign. We can't go without any politics today. And then I've got a final piece I'd like to share with you that is very unusual. It is actually my favorite chapter in the book. It is about my state police security detail who protected me and took care of me and kept me safe while I was governor. And we can't find any evidence that any governor or public official has ever written about the security detail. So here on this campus, where we've trained lots of state police and other police, it seems the appropriate place to get to share that part with you too. Okay, I'm going to read first from the chapter, this is chapter 2, called Small Town Girl. Few acts of chance have more influence on our lives than the family we are born into. I was one lucky little girl. I was born in Corvallis, Oregon, on the first day of winter, December 21st, 1936. And so that you don't have to calculate, I will be 75 in December. I was born into a household filled with love and kindness and respect. My mother was a farmer's daughter from Montana. My father was a preacher's son from Oregon. They met in an Oregon logging camp where my dad, Bob Huey, worked in the mill, and my mother, Carmen Murray, cooked for the work crew. They married in 1935 and were married for 55 years until my father's death. I am a descendant of Oregon Trail pioneers, the fourth generation of my family to be born in the state. My sister Pat was born 2 years later on December the 20th, 1938, so our birthdays were just one day apart. We celebrated our December birthdays together for over 60 years until her untimely death in February of 2001. As far back as I can remember, our home was always filled with laughter and hugs, good food, and no bickering. My mother was a wonderful cook and a great pie maker. She had a cheerful disposition, and for all the early years of my life, she sewed frilly dresses, little pinafores, and crocheted outfits for my sister and me. And because Pat and I usually had matching dresses, we were often mistaken for twins. Years of photos still exist of us, round-cheeked, blonde-curled, standing or seating in our matching dresses and matched shoes and socks. My father had a good singing voice, and every car trip, no matter how short, turned into a sing-along. As a kid, I knew all the words to almost every song recorded by Bing Crosby and by the Mills Brothers. Dad's favorites were Paper Doll and Red Sails in the Sunset, and no drive was complete without them. How could I feel anything but loved? How could a little girl growing up in that household not gain the confidence that comes from feeling special? Whatever there is about me that is solid came from that home and that upbringing. My father gave up lumber mill work at the end of the 1930s and became a skilled machinist. In 1940, our family of four moved to Los Angeles, California. Good jobs seemed plentiful in Southern California as the 1940s began. My dad was quickly employed, and soon life seemed all about playing in the sunshine, roller skating and skinned knees, weekend baseball games, and Sunday picnics, and lots of cousins, aunts, and uncles. Just before my 5th birthday, our world changed dramatically with the bombing of America's naval fleet at Pearl Harbor and the entry of the U.S. into World War II. Uncles and cousins went to war. My dad's plant was converted to wartime production. Dad, a night foreman now in a vital war industry, was exempt from foreign battlefields, but quickly took responsibility as an air raid warden in our Los Angeles neighborhood. If the warning siren went off and his searchlight scanned the skies for enemy planes, Dad would slip on his warden armband and his official helmet and make certain every light was off in our home. And then he patrolled the neighborhood streets while we huddled close to Mother in our darkened house and waited for the all-clear siren and for Daddy's footsteps at the front door. Only then were we safe again. Looking back at World War II, I believe my sense of duty, my commitment to public service was born in those war years. The patriotism of the period was strongly felt. We learned to ration meat and other foods and gasoline. We planted victory gardens. We did without chocolate. Now that was a sacrifice. We donated our beloved rubber dolls to the rubber drive for the war effort. We felt weepy, Pat and me, but it was for our boys in uniform, and we understood that that mattered. When World War II ended in 1945, my parents decided that Los Angeles might not be the best location to raise 2 little girls. They thought we'd be safer and more sheltered in some small Oregon town. They wanted my sister and me to experience the sense of community that comes from small town living. So from the city of Los Angeles burgeoning in post-war growth, we were suddenly living next to a small country highway with the Yamhill River bordering our backyard, 4 miles from the closest small town, and attending a one-room school without indoor plumbing. Gold Creek School was 1/2 mile from our house, and on school days we walked along the road, single file beside the highway, taking extra care when the big, noisy logging trucks thundered by. The one-room school had only a big closet for coats and boots and lunch pails, and then the classroom with various sized desks to fit the wide range of ages being taught in that single room. Our teacher, Mrs. Petit, was a tall Native American woman with big, rough hands and gentle eyes and voice. I had come from a huge Los Angeles school and almost literally stepped back into another century. Yet, I've always been grateful for that experience. I learned to read and to study while other activities were happening all around me. And I learned how long I could hold my breath in an outhouse. 2.5 years at Gold Creek, my family moved to the 9 miles to Sheridan, the town where my dad worked at the local machine shop. I still consider Sheridan my hometown. Sheridan was a fun, secure, safe, happy place to grow up. Pat and I belonged to Girl Scouts and then Rainbow Girls. We were active in a wide range of school activities. Mother was our Girl Scout leader. Dad coached our girls' summer softball league. I was the team's catcher. Soon Pat was on the tumbling team and a strong member of the high school volleyball team. I was editor of the high school paper, student body officer, president of the service club, speech competition and school plays activities, and Pat and I were both high school cheerleaders. You might expect that. In the summer, I picked strawberries and green beans to earn extra money for my school clothes. I'd put the next fall's school wardrobe on layaway at the local mercantile store and then work like the dickens to pay off the items before the summer crop harvest season ended. Yet, summer wasn't all work. My girlfriends and I owned bicycles, and several of us often packed a lunch, tied a towel to the handlebars, and rode out to a swimming place in the wonderful, sparkling little country creek. On a hot day, that cooling stream was totally inviting, but the added attraction were the local schoolboys, the farm boys, who showed up after their chores were done to cool off in the very same swimming spot. We went to school with these boys from September to June, but during the summer months, we didn't often see them in town. These bike rides were always presented as biking and swimming excursions and an opportunity to earn points toward our Girls Athletic Association letters. We would never have confessed that these bike rides also turned into a great opportunity to practice our flirting skills. The truth be known, I never learned to swim. However, one summer I did learn to kiss underwater. I learned some other life skills growing up in a small town. First, in order to make things happen, almost everyone needed to pitch in and help. If you wanted to have a parade, first you worked together to build a float, and then you rode on the float. I thought the whole world operated that way. By the time I was a teenager, I had little concept of the role of spectator. I was never good on the sidelines. I always loved being part of the parade. Now that all sounds pretty idyllic, and in many ways it was. However, there was little encouragement for girls to step forward, to lead, to question in the 1950s. High school girls did not become student body presidents. We were the secretaries of student bodies all over America. And just try and imagine this today. I was a student body officer, class salutatorian, speech competition winner, cheerleader, editor of the school newspaper, and no one ever suggested that I think about college. It was the 1950s, and in small-town blue-collar USA, girls married and had children and disappeared into the kitchens of America. And nobody blinked, nobody questioned, not even those bright, motivated, energetic young women, not even them. Now, I'm going to take you from my childhood. That was brief. I'm all done being a child now. And I'm going to take you to 1990. Let's see if I can find the right page here. I'm going to give you a little preface. It is the fall of 1990. The governor's race is on the ballot. There are 4 candidates in the general election. Myself, who was Secretary of State, Dave Frommeyer, who was then Attorney General of the state, a guy named Fred Orther, who was a libertarian, and Al Mobley, who was an independent candidate. So 4 candidates. Just a second here. Makes me thirsty just to say that. I also want to set another little tone here to put this in perspective. My husband, who was a state senator, had had cancer, and he lost his ability to walk, so he was permanently in a wheelchair. And just not very many weeks before this fall campaign got underway, Frank had an accident with his motorized wheelchair. He turned it over, he broke his hip, and he had to have a hip replacement. So I'm in the fall campaign, and my husband is in the hospital, and he is not doing well. So let me jump right into the 1990 campaign for governor. I began preparing for the first of the 4 scheduled gubernatorial debates, this one on September 12. This first date would be held in the University City of Eugene, where Dave Frommeyer and his family lived. Sponsored by the local League of Women Voters, the noon debate would be televised by the local station, rerun in prime time that evening on one of Portland's TV stations, and aired live on several radio stations, including public radio. All 4 candidates would be included in this debate. In the 3 debates that would follow, only Dave and I would appear together. Responses for the candidates in the Eugene debate were limited to 1 minute. A few days before I headed to Eugene for the debate, Frank was transferred to a different hospital to receive some new method of therapy for his hip. Recovery was not going well, and he was experiencing far more pain than normal this long after surgery. I was growing more and more concerned. The afternoon before the debate, I headed to the hospital again to check on Frank. I was planning to drive the 2 hours to Eugene late that afternoon and stay overnight. When I reached the hospital, Frank was looking quite tired and haggard. He could not get comfortable in his hospital bed, and he hadn't eaten his breakfast or his lunch. I was used to dealing with his pain, but that afternoon his eyes reflected a much more severe pain. I knew the look. I consulted with the nursing staff and insisted that the doctor examine Frank that evening. I said I would call back the first thing the next morning from Eugene. At 7:30 a.m., I called the hospital to get the doctor's report and to speak to Frank. Frank was no longer in the hospital. He had left by ambulance very early that morning to transfer back to his regular hospital in preparation for a second surgery on his hip. They would be operating at 11:30 a.m., just before the scheduled debate. The ball joint on the hip replacement had slipped out of place and created a puncture wound that had finally pierced Frank's tissue and skin from the inside out. The reason for his pain was clearly visible by the time his surgeon examined him the previous evening. Frank had refused to let them contact me in Eugene about his pending surgery. I felt overcome with guilt. I called the second hospital and reached the surgical ward. Frank was already under heavy sedation, and they were prepping him for the operation. I would just have to go ahead with the debate and call the hospital as soon as I finished, and then drive directly back to be there when he got out of recovery. This is definitely not the frame of mind one needs to face a tough campaign debate. I wanted to cry like a baby. I wanted to be at Frank's side, but I pulled myself together, focused on my debate materials, and waited to go downstairs to the hotel dining room for the first big debate in my race for governor. This would have been a tough moment under the best of circumstances. This, however, was not the best of times. For a highly pressured hour, we exchanged jabs and answers on land use, abortion, the death penalty, taxes, timber, and even the debate schedule. Finally, the last question was posed by radio reporter Bob Valdez, a question that the Eugene Register Guard described as the most telling question and answer of the entire debate. This is the question. If you were not running for this office, who among the other candidates here today would you vote for? And none is not an answer. We had been rotating our order on all previous questions, and on this amazing question, I would be the final responder. Both Mobley and Arthur ignored the reporter's instructions and said they would cast their vote for themselves. When Dave's turn came, I expected better of him. I was disappointed. Dave indicated that he was the only candidate on the stage prepared to be Oregon's governor, and he would have to vote for himself. Now it was my turn. I felt obligated to follow the instructions the radio announcer had laid out. Unlike the three men on this stage, I said, I will answer the question we were all asked. If I were not in this race, I would vote for the only other person on this platform qualified to be the governor of Oregon. I was cast my vote for Dave Frohnmayer. Well, the crowd applauded loudly and longly and approvingly. The Oregonians said that the three male candidates had ducked the question. The Eugene Register Guard said I had delivered, quote, the perfect answer, exactly what Frohnmayer should have said about Roberts, unquote. The Eugene paper declared me the winner of the first debate. Their headline, Round 1 for Roberts. As worried as I was about Frank's surgery, I never imagined I would be able to do well in that debate. However, I just steeled myself, faced what I could not change, and did my job, and now it was done. That evening, I watched the rerun of the Eugene debate with Frank in his Portland hospital room. My speech professor husband gave me a very good grade, as you might expect. He celebrated the answer I delivered on the final question. He thought it was brilliant. Of course, he thought everything I did was brilliant, but Frank believed that Dave had damaged himself when he wimped out on that particular question. Frank, even on pain meds, could discern that the voters knew when one avoided the truth. A number of newscasts that night and the next day showed the segment with all four of the candidates answering. Those news clips were decidedly more helpful than most candidates' paid commercials. I obviously won that election, by the way. And I'm now going to share the piece I told you about the state police. They're technically, the people who do state police for a governor are called dignitary protection units. That's the technical term. So they are not your drivers. They are not driving Miss Daisy. So this chapter is entitled Good Guys with Guns. And I'm going to start on the second page of the chapter so that I will have time to finish and do questions. Many governors who have constant security protection find it stifling and intrusive. I made up my mind that I would avoid that frustration. I would do my job, they would do theirs. I would never think of them as in my way. For me, that turned out to be a wise decision. I was rewarded with mutual respect, friendship, enlightening war stories, and hundreds of hours of great conversation as we drove throughout the state and traveled internationally. Very soon I felt privileged to have their protection plus their companionship. However, you can't spend 4 years in close connection with any group without collecting some stories worth telling, and my dignitary protection guys were no exception to that rule. First of all, there was only one woman, Pam Peterson, in the unit. Pam was strong and determined and was a member of the class of the first 10 female sworn officers in the Oregon State Police. However, quite realistically, with only one woman in my protection unit, most time I was accompanied by only male officers. For years, I had been active in women's rights work. That commitment didn't end when I became governor. So my officers sat through events for the Oregon Women's Political Caucus, the League of Women Voters, and Planned Parenthood. Often they were the only men in the room. It was a little difficult to blend in. Believe me, the women in those audiences didn't miss the humor of that situation. One of my other longtime areas of political and civil rights work was focused in the gay community. I attended dinners, made speeches, and received awards from the gay and lesbian community throughout my term as governor. And where I went, my security detail went. For some of the officers, this was no big deal. For other members of the unit, there may have been some social adjustment. However, after 4 years, my officers were recognized in the community and gained the support and respect of a number of Oregon gay leaders. The best story to come out of this experience took place during the 1992 Democratic National Convention in New York City. I had been asked to deliver a speech to the first ever official evening reception for all of the gay and lesbian delegates at the convention. I arrived with 2 of my officers and my friend Terry Bean, an Oregon and national gay leader. We were slowly working our way toward the stage in a shoulder-to-shoulder crowd, with me following at Officer Chastain's elbow. The next morning, when the daily convention newspaper was released, the front page story contained Officer Chastain's up-close photo under the headline, "Gay Delegates Meet." By the time we returned home to Oregon, Glenn's photo and the headline were on every state police bulletin board in Oregon. The photo I always wished I had, however, would have brought real laughs from the bulletin boards across the state. The unrecorded incident took place between my November 1990 election and my swearing-in ceremony in January of 1991. I was Christmas shopping with my mother at a mall in Portland and was looking for a gift that was on my daughter-in-law's Christmas list. Mother and I ended up at Victoria's Secret, accompanied by 2 of my security officers. The 2 officers were trying to look invisible as they moved along the walls of the lingerie store. Focused on shopping, I walked behind a rack of bathrobes, and since I am barely 5'3" tall, I was suddenly out of view of my officers. When the officers could not make a visual, they became concerned. They had lost the new governor. They asked my mother where I was, and she looked around, didn't know where I disappeared. I don't think she was very worried. In the quiet but fast-paced confusion, Officer Greg Lockwood backed into a metal rack of bras, spilling them loudly across the floor. Hearing the noise, I stepped out from the bathrobe rack to see what had happened. Spotting me and knowing I was safe, Officer Lockwood uprighted the rack and began retrieving a rainbow of bras off the floor, rehanging them one by one on the rack. His bright red face fit in perfectly with the colorful bras. How I wished for a camera. We never let Greg forget the day that he lost the governor in Victoria's Secret. But for me, the state police story wouldn't be complete without sharing a final special memory. After Frank's death and his cremation in October and November of 1993, I decided not to inter his ashes until his birthday on December 28th. Once that decision was made, I felt sad that Frank's beautiful urn and his ashes were stored in the dark mausoleum vault in Portland. I decided to bring Frank home for Thanksgiving and Christmas. My state police officers always waited outside while I did business at the mausoleum. This day was no exception. As I walked out of the door of the funeral home, I was carrying Frank's urn wrapped in a black velvet bag. The urn and the ashes were quite heavy, and Officer Darrell Burning jumped forward to help. He gently took the urn from me, set it carefully in the back seat, reached up and grabbed the seat belt, locked it securely, and then sweetly patted the urn and said, "There, Senator, everything looks comfortable." So much for tough guys with guns. But this final story represents a special place these officers held in my life for 4 years. They made a tough job easier. They made me feel safe in some very threatening situations. They felt like family. They had my back. Thank you. First thing, the thing I tried to do while I was governor and would do if I were queen and could just put my magic wand out there and make something happen, I would take the design that I did way back in 1992 for restructuring Oregon's tax structure and put it in place and get rid of the mess we've got now. I want to be able to fund education from preschool through graduate school, and we can't do that with that tax structure. I want local government to have adequate services to serve the people of those communities, and I want the state to be able to do the job they're supposed to do. The second piece of legal change I would make is I would get rid of the, I can't even remember the ballot number on it anymore, but does anybody know the number of the ballot measure that put all the kids in jail? Okay, Measure 11. I would get rid of Measure 11 tomorrow morning, tonight, this afternoon. It is far too strict, far too inflexible. Judges ought to be able to do the job that judges are supposed to do, and Measure 11 ruined the lives of a lot of young people in the state, put them in jail when they didn't belong in jail, when they needed treatment or some other kind of supervision. That would be the second thing I would do. Gee, the third thing I'd do, I might find a king, I don't know. Oh, and let me just say, your comment about Dave Frohmeyer, all during the campaign, particularly before the debate started, my staff on the campaign used to say, oh my, and that was then followed by, Dave Frohmeyer debated in Oxford. Dave Frohmeyer argued before the Supreme Court. I don't know how you could face him. They would do that to me all the time. So when I beat him in at least 3 of the 4 debates, actually there were 5 debates, but I beat him in most of the debates. I think he got me in one, but they used to kid me all the time about how can you beat somebody who's argued before the Supreme Court, or at Oxford. But the truth is, the kind of debating you do in front of a courtroom and the kind of debating you do in university debate is not the same as political debate. I had more skill at political debate. When I ran for Secretary of State, Donna Zajan and I had 16 debates in the general election. I'd had more political debates than probably anybody in Oregon. So Dave had the academic part of it, but I had the kind of the fighter's, toughness. So. Yes. I don't believe the death penalty is a solution to anything. It only makes us less humane, and the money we spend trying to execute people doesn't stop crime and it doesn't stop murder. And I would add to you that I felt very fortunate while I was governor that I never had to make that decision. It came very close a couple of times, and I was on the phone talking to Senator Mark Hatfield in D.C. because he'd done a death penalty case while he was governor, and then came out later against the death penalty. And there was a governor in Colorado that I talked to several times, trying to understand what this decision felt like and what it meant when somebody was actually making a life or death decision. I did not want to be the person who made that life or death decision. Not because I wasn't tough enough to do it. I didn't think anybody could be wise enough to do it. For a long time, I'm going to market books. Yeah, I'm doing a lot of traveling right now. I was over in Central Oregon last week, and I'm going down to Grants Pass next week, and I'm in Corvallis next week too, and over to the coast. So I'm doing a lot of Oregon book readings and events right now, and several of them on campuses, which I really like to do. And then once spring comes, I'm going to try to get back east. I've got a couple of national television shows I want to get on, and so I'm hoping I'll have an opportunity today to do that. And any of you who blog, you might like to look, I'm so proud of this, but you might like to look at Al Gore's current blog for this week. I'm there. He said, my very good friend, Governor Barbara Roberts, just released her book, and 2.2 million people read his blog, so I'm pretty excited about that. So I have a feeling this book is going to keep me busy for a while. She mentioned my first book. I wrote a book on death and grieving that came out 11 years ago called Death Without Denial, Grief Without Apology. And it is still on the market. People are still using it, including hospice programs all over the United States. So I'm very proud of the book. It was to help people deal with terminal diagnosis. And I have a nephew who's dying of Lou Gehrig's disease right now, and we're back reading the book again. I'd forgotten it because in terms of reading it aloud, but I read it to a couple of groups last week associated with friends of his he went to high school with and stuff. So it was interesting to be back sharing that book again. So. A way out of it's very interesting. First way you get out of it is to get the heavy, heavy money out of politics. Not all of it, but the heavy money. But let me make a distinction from your question about politics. There is a lot of difference between national politics and state politics, particularly the state of Oregon. When people are talking about nothing is getting accomplished in Washington, D.C., I'm citing for them that in the last legislative session earlier this year, that the Oregon House of Representatives had 30 Republicans and 30 Democrats, and they put through more legislation in that House than probably in the last 20 years. So it can happen, it does happen, it's happening here, not perfectly, but a whole lot better than it is in a lot of other states, and certainly much better than it is at the federal level. I think that the level of money and the corporate involvement in the political arena has gotten totally out of hand, and it causes candidates for Congress to do nothing but raise money. They don't have time to do anything but raising those millions of dollars. There is no way that you can get the country back in order if every day is about picking up the phone and raising money or going to a fundraiser constantly. You can't run a campaign with no money. I want to be clear about that. People want to see their candidates on TV. They want to at least see what they look like. They want to have you send out a brochure and tell what you stand for. They want some input from their candidates. So that input doesn't come for free. And you have to have a staff, for instance, if you're traveling all over the nation or all over the state, you have to have staff who helps you. That doesn't come for free. So you can't take all of the money out of politics. That's not realistic. I mean, how could you run a campaign that reached out to people at all? So you've got to think of how you temper that actual physical monetary need for a campaign with the kind of money that is just, I mean, I think it's indecent. I mean, I don't know any other word that describes where it is now. So I'm glad to see the discussion going on about a U.S. constitutional amendment that it reverses the Supreme Court decision that says that corporations are people. I think that'd be a nice place to start. Well, it wasn't so subtle always. It was actually an advantage that there were three of us in the race, three men in the race, and I was the only woman. It was kind of, I didn't have to say, look at me, I'm a girl. You know, I didn't need to do that. It was sort of evident. And because I was not allowed to wear anything but skirts during the campaign, because every time I wore a pair of slacks, we got a nasty set of letters. And that was true when I was governor, too, by the way. So it was pretty evident I was a female. But I think not only that distinction, but the liability of it was people would look at you and wonder if you were strong enough. And they would wonder if you were experienced enough. They would wonder who was taking care of your children. I mean, all kinds of things that nobody cared about for male candidates. And I had been serving for 6 years in the second highest office in Oregon, the Secretary of State's office. And in the Secretary of State's office in Oregon, you are the lieutenant governor. So I'd served with two different governors for the past 6 years. I'd worked intimately with the governor's office, and I'd been the state auditor, so I knew all the financial stuff about state agencies. I was well prepared to do it, and my family came on the Oregon Trail. I knew a little bit about Oregon and its history, and I'd probably spent more time traveling around Oregon than any other candidate in that race, maybe any race. And of course, so now I get to do it for fun. So I came with a lot of assets, but the people just look at you and they don't see leader. I'm not tall enough, for one thing. I'm just too short to be a leader. And so if you're not tall enough and you're not masculine enough, people, particularly then, looked at you as not being a leader. And so you had to find ways to demonstrate that you were a leader, and that was the hardest thing. I knew a lot about the economy of the state. I knew a lot about the history. I knew the government, state and local. I knew the school systems inside out because I'd been a school board member for 14 years. So I had a lot of other experiences that I brought to the table. And I'd been in small business. My family was in small business. So I brought assets, but I brought the liability of being a woman. Today, I don't think that's such a liability. I think today, we've seen strong women governors and U.S. senators and members of Congress and heads of colleges and heads of big corporations. So I think we've seen women do almost everything now, secretaries of state at the federal level. So I think Speaker of the House, I think now it's not the liability, but back then, when you're the first one, it's still hard. And I have to tell you, two women were serious candidates for governor of Oregon prior to my being elected, Betty Roberts and Norma Paulus. They both lost their elections, but had it not been for their races, I don't think I would have won mine. They helped the public begin to think about a woman governor. And I think there is a lot to be said for the people who have the courage to run when they can't win. And nobody thought I could win when I got in the race. We used to kid that the only two people who thought I could win were my husband and my father, and not my campaign manager. And so I got into a race that nobody really thought I could win, and I won. So thank you.
Thank you for your inspiring